All right, so welcome. Today we are going to be going over slicing for 3D models. 6 or 7 years ago, when I was trying to get started into 3D printing, it turned me off on 3D printing, just the slicing aspect of files. At that time, Ender was still trying to figure out how to get printers made that were cost effective, that didn't require a million custom printed little parts just to shore things up, this thing, that thing. Slicing software was chunky at best, so dialing it in was a feat of magical know-how depending on each of the single printers. There was so many things to go wrong with it. PLAs and ABS materials were inconsistent at best. So 3D printing has come a long way in the last half a decade. And one of those things is the slicing software. There's a dozen of them out there I've looked into. But the one that seems to be the cleanest and most consistent is this Ultimaker Cura slicing software, which was made for their custom 3D printers. But they opened it up to all of them because I guess they realized that you might have different printers than what they offer. And so this is free, completely free software, which is awesome because they have all they have multiple preset settings for printers, for materials, for all sorts of stuff. And so what we end up with is this wonderful software that can do so much in different ways. And now it's on to the 5th version of it. It's like 5.2 or something like that. And they have gone through so much testing phase of experimental things that are now become solidified as very clean and very well done. And so today we're going to go over some of the interface, some of the things about it, and then some of the basic settings. Later on in another video, I'll go over just supports, and then another one in just the infills, because those are the ones where you have some of the best options, but it's also some of the things that change the most. So today I have a file loaded up from Tinkercad that I just worked together because for something I'm going to be able to sculpt later on. It's got 2 components to it. You can load up into Cura a million different files in here if you need to. It will actually let you have an object list right where my head is over here, in this spot here. There is a spot where there's an object list, so everything that you add into this gets put there. It also has a way to make shorthand files, so that way it's set up for specifically for your printer that you have, if you have multiple printers, and as well as the different types of materials. So that being said, let's go over some of the basics. Up at the very top, you got your basic stuff, files, all of your settings, stuff like that. You can actually save your project if you have multiple stuff, so that way you don't have to redo your work if you need to make like one little change. There is the top-down menu, which goes from prepare, preview, and monitor. Monitors for when you actually have a printer hooked up to your computer and need to be able to monitor what stage they're on. Mine isn't set up for that. It's set up with a USB drive. Preview is just when you actually slice your work. It'll show you all the layer slices, and of course prepare. So when you open up your file and it gets put onto the surface, let's talk for a minute about the models in this area here. Once you get your printer set up, through whichever way you need to set it up, you're given this workspace here. This gives you all of the dimensions. You can set this preset. You can set this custom if you have a DIY setup. You can set it up as specific as you need to in some of the settings, or just use the preset like I do. But it gives you an area of where you know that print volume will be. Your model itself will be composed of 3 different colors. You will be given a blue for where it touches. You will be given yellow for the body, and anywhere where there seems to be a part that might be unsupported will come through as red. And I chose this one because it has some very small features in here, and so when you make sculptures, it tends to have wonky supports some way, shape, or form. So I'll be using this model for a lot of the various aspects of this modeling process, because it's got some sharp points and it's got some infill areas that tighten and expand, and it also has spots for infill. Alright, so that being said, let's talk about the materials. As I said, there are a lot of preset options for all of your filaments, and this is fantastic because I know that I was actually looking at this eSun PLA Plus, and so they have it set up just specifically for that different color of PLA Plus, and I was looking at that and I thought, I almost think I might buy that eventually. But you have these different things. They also have all the generic ones as well. So if you do have a specific material that is supported by your printer, they might have it in here. I myself am just going with a gray PLA generic filament. Nothing fancy. It's even a completely generic brand. So I'm just going for generic PLA. The next option over here is all of your basic settings, and we'll go over those in a minute because just because we have some options to go along with this. The next part is your menu or your tool menu over here, which once you select an item, notice how it's grayed out when it's not selected, when something's not selected. When you have an object selected, you have options for a lot of things in here. The first one is being your move. You can easily move this through directional moving, or you can even do it by a numerical value. I'm just going to say 30 millimeters, and that's going to move it over in the direction of this red arrow here, 30 millimeters. So what it uses as 0 is the absolute 0 value of your build plate. So right there is your 0, 0, and that's what it bases that off of. One other quick note, you also notice how there's a shadow there. That's the rough volume of the area which this item takes up space. So if you have an item that you want to place next to this and you wanted to make sure that this does not obstruct into another area of it, they leave a shadow there for things that have overhangs, which is nice. It's estimated, because I mean, if you can see, it just barely estimates that out into a rough shape, but it's nice to do. The next part in this is going to be your scale. Your scale has a few ways of doing it. Uniform scaling makes sure that you can't adjust one singular direction. So that way, anything you do scales up. If you do try to move these things, it will try to place it on the base plate no matter what. So for example, if I try to move this guy up, it'll just drag it right back down again. If I scale him where he might go underneath the base plate, it'll go to the top. So there's things that it will keep it try to be as level to the base plate as possible. Snap scaling, it just goes in single clicking increments. And then of course you have the ability to do percentages or physical sizes if you have a specific size you need to do. Rotate is pretty much straightforward. They have snap rotation, and they have regular rotation. They have the ability to lay flat. They have all sorts of crazy stuff. Like this is just takes a little bit, and you can do so much with it. So that one is what it is. It's a very clean, straightforward process. You can even have it so, come on. So we're going to reset this up. Sometimes it goes kind of crazy with, like you just saw. When you do have access to this, it does remove it on singular accesses if you need to. So it's nice, and especially if you save clicker rotation, if you have more square objects and things that might be able to be set up linear, this is a fantastic way of doing that. So that way it doesn't try to like auto arrange it in weird ways. Mirroring is pretty much straightforward. It is quite frankly, just one direction or the other. So that's kind of nice if you need to have multiple objects that might look different or just interact in different ways. Per model settings, this is fantastic. If you have multiple objects on here, so for example, I'm going to select this guy. I'm going to duplicate this guy. Go to multiply selected. If I wanted to make sure that these two things printed with separate settings for infill and supports the whole 9 yards, it would allow me to do that in this tool setting. This requires a little bit of practice, but you can easily do it. It does not change the layer setting though. That is pretty much straightforward, because that way you don't have to have too many different variables. So it does limit it to only the infill supports and things like that, and adhesion sort of settings. Support blocker. This is a fantastic one. Let me get rid of this guy. This is a fantastic tool for these models here. Now, before I do that, let's get into movement. Right now, if you see I'm using my right click, you can move it around and it's centered on one particular point. I now need to move this down, so there's 3 clicks I can do. I can either hold down shift and drag my part down, and then there's the other one where I can use my scroll wheel and zoom it in and out. You can also use your left and right up and down keys, and it will also pivot as well. And shift. Yeah, so there you go. With your item selected, blocker support blocker provides one distinct and awesome element. It allows you to go through and provide areas in which the supports are not going to be added into or taken into account on your model. And you can make them different sizes, I believe. I just go through and try to get as small of an area that's covered as possible. And I'm going to do one right here, just so I get half of that crown support that it thinks it might need. And I'm going to leave this one completely unblocked. So when we do some support work, it might show up, it might not, but we'll show you some of the options on this one. And so if you notice on my object list here, it might start showing up. It will actually count all of these items in that object list. So if you need to remove just a specific one because there might be a duplicate or something like that, you can remove just that one, select that one, and then have options for just that one. Now, with that being said, you also have the ability to slice. You have all of your options. Your basic settings are straightforward. With my printer, I have a 0.4 millimeter print head. So everything is all based off of micro prints of that sizing. So I know after doing numerous tests that 0.1 is going to be my fine adjustment size. Doing 0.06, I tend to get a little bit of a squishy, sort of like a bold squish. It's too tight for the extrusion that comes out. So 0.1 is my smallest I can probably do right now with my printer without any sort of micro adjustments. 0.06 on the other side is super thick. That means that for every, even though my width of my print head is 0.4, that means it is taller than my print head is wide. So this is going to be a very chunky, very inclusion filled, almost like thick jam on a peanut butter jelly sandwich that gets squished down. So it's going to be not a clean, smooth surface, even if I tried. So try to make sure your print width does not become less than your print height, and you might have a chance of having even with a chunky fill, a decent print. So, and this is just the size of the layers. This determines how much time you want to take, how many layers you're going to get, how thick it is, how coarse it's going to look, and of course how much deviation you might get from just the flow. If something goes off on a 0.1 layer, it might not look like it's something wrong later on, because it's such a small layer moving so fast that it's sort of like scraping butter across toast. Whereas bigger sizes have more of a chance for one layer to go off a little bit, and then that next layer to catch on that and go the opposite way, and then it stacks up, and you see that difference in print width. Infill is straightforward. How much material fills the inside? And so there's multiple different ways. The one that I use as my setting is the tri-hexagon, and I'll show you why in a minute. I'll show you why in the next video. But by default, it will come through and say to do a 20% infill, and you can change that all the way up to be a solid brick if you need to, as 100%. Supports, that is the rafts that come up and connect to your body. Adhesion. This is the part which by default is a brim. It's sort of like the hat, the brim on a cowboy hat comes straight off the base, goes straight out, and it connects to the very first layer. I'm going to keep it as the defaulted one, and we're going to do some support work, non-support work, and some general infill options with some slices. So, with our blockers in place, with 20% infill, which is a decent infill for something this small, and then with a 0.1 layer, we can have the adhesion with the brim on there, so you can see what that looks like. You can then come down and slice your work. And this is a relatively simple one, so it only takes like a few seconds. It'll come up with telling me that right now it will take 7 hours and 34 minutes to print this. And it'll even tell me the estimated amount of material I might use. So 13 meters, which is 36 feet of material, out of a 1 kilogram roll. I'm pretty much going to use no material. What this does do is it lets me either preview it down here or preview it here, which has the slicing layers available. It shows me what each layer will look like. It will show me where things are blocked out, where things aren't. So let's go to the top layer. At 0.01, as you can see here, I might have a chunky tip to this crown. So it's going to stagger step up here. This might require some fine filing, and I might lose a good amount of material here. And this is at the finest setting that it's saying it's going to do this at. Now, if you notice, there's a lot of colors in this work. Let's go down to the middle, to the very, very middle layer, so we can go over these colors. Red is your outside layer. This little white line is the part where it is the next. It basically tells the printer that it will go to the next layer at that point. So it will raise up when it finishes all of its process. That's where it starts on the next layer. Green is what it does second. Oop. I accidentally added some stuff. Alright, so green is the inner wall area. By default, it has two walls. So this is it goes by the width of your print head, which is, mine is a 0.4 millimeter print head. So this is a 0.8 millimeter wall with two layers combined. As I said, this is a tri-hexagon pattern, and I do this for numerous ways. One is because I want these inclusion lines, these impact lines, to be layered out as a solid wall with as minimal amount of overlapping as possible. Some of them might have 2 to 4 points of continuous touching and hitting this wall. And so like right here, I know that I might have a little bit of a sandwich effect, so there might be a little bit of a warping bubble as it goes inner line, outer line, then this. Then the next line goes outer line, inner line, over that line, doing it again. And with it having 2 points where it touches, it might be a problem right there. Now this right here, this blue line, would be is your brim. This goes around on your first layer and gets your print head going. And it goes all the way in and starts the red line. Then your green lines, and then the yellow infills. Then the next layer is where it starts to build up. And I have 6 layers that would fill up and make the base of this work. Come on. So 6 layers. And then it starts the infill, which then lets you know that there's going to be another set. Now when you're looking at your models and you want to see how things print, points of high extrusion, all the way up here, points of high extrusion up here, you would start to see multiple colors. Now if you see right there, what I would see is that there is the top outer ring, and we're going to see a little bit of a haloing step effect when it comes up to this. And this is going to be a very fine amount here, but we get to see that there are some infills, the outer ring, and also the inner ring, all visible in this area here. And when I did my little test here, this was extremely smooth for what I saw at a 0.1. But when you look at this to this, you can see all those layers of lines. So keep that in mind, because when you do large fills, that might be slightly more visible. As you can see, as this thing curves up the edge, you see all of that second wall as it tries to stagger all of that through. So this would be a much chunkier print at 0.4. You would see a whole big flat part right here. And when you go down into these layers here, that right there has 2 lines of infill to try to carry that shoulder. Look at that infill, just trying to carry a shoulder as it catches up. kind of interesting to watch because it lets you know how to do this. Now, in older, like 5-6 years ago, that little yellow part would have been non-existent in most slices. So just showing that that's there is one of the best reasons for using Cura. And that's why I love using this model here, because it lets me use, check out fine point details, and it lets me use the infills properly to change all that around. But I can see that versus this slice right here is drastically different. You see how much thinner lined that was, how much less fill there was to try to carry that shoulder. So I know that neck is not going to be as thick or show as many lines. Infill is the other option here. This is a pretty solid area, and if I try to move this guy around, right to there, you can see this goes straight down. And so there's a lot of room for volume in there. If I say move this to 50% and then slice this guy down, that little area is much more complex. For small items, you might need to go small, like a higher infill, just to cover your support in areas that might have to go ahead and try to grab and move straight up. Mainly because it doesn't need to have as wide of an area on, say, bigger items. This one, I used a 10% infill, and so it was pretty big. I could almost slide a pencil straight down this guy. Yeah, see, I can slide a pencil up and down in this, which is fun. But, you know, something that's smaller, probably about that big, probably might need a 50% infill just for the sake of what it is. Supports, on the other hand, this is where the fun one is. Get rid of that random thing that I added. As we said, everything that has this red area might need a support, and that's because it doesn't follow along the curve into a certain area that it needs to be. And so what you might end up with is some layer slumping as it tries to float over that edge, and you might see it. Something this small would not show up, but it will cause issues with supports, which is where support blockers come in. If you have fine details that you know you don't need to have supported, you might need to use support blockers if you have supports that are needed for other things. Like, I believe I used a support blocker on these guys, because there was an overhang, just a little bit of an overhang, but it would have caused extra supports to come up and try to raft into this, creating for a chunky bit. And I already had a seam. In particular, I already had a seam. That little white line right there, that is this right here. I already have to clean up the seam. It's a textured, detailed area, so I don't have to worry too much about removing all of the seam, but this is enough where there's a sandwiching area. So, when I have that here, I sometimes might not want to have supports that also might add to some inclusions and some chunkiness and some sticky points. So, that's what those come in. But if I add in a support and then we add a slice in, it will show up like the blue brim on this model. And right now I have one right there. This one is called a tree support. And this one is trying to graft into that that crown. And I've blocked off most of that. Now, where this does come into play is you see how there's none on the shoulder here. In some of the custom settings, let's default this back to normal. A normal support, which is straight up where it needs to go from. The placement would be everywhere, and the overhang angle is around 50%. if you were to slice this out as a generic setting, that is what you would see. That would build a support off of the shoulder of the sculpture onto the head and then all the way up into the crown. And you'd have to remove this. And while it's not supposed to truly touch, it's still going to be close enough that you're going to have to yank this guy off of it and crush it off and then end up having to file it and sand it. But if you notice where the support block is on the other side, nothing's there. The other side is if you had a very large scale model or a very large cut, and you'll see how that supports a little bit weirder. Like that doesn't support anything. That one little blue line, and sometimes it'll even show up on the neck. Sometimes it'll show up in weird little places. So you might have to work with trying to see whether you do want supports or not. With this one, I'm going to be testing it out for you guys with 0.1, 0.2, and 0.4 settings that I'm going to slice out. And I'm going to go ahead and do the test prints for each one so you can see the difference in the print quality. And then we're going to compare them to this slice of where they're at right here, because the crown, the shoulder, and the undercut are going to be the biggest things when it comes to this. How much detail they hold, how much detail that they want to hold, and where all of that detail goes. So that's one thing to consider when you're slicing out. And that's the general gist to this whole thing. So I'll have 11 hours for this print here at 0.1. We're only going to use a 20% infill for this one. So I'm going to have one for 7 hours. 4 hours, and a 2-hour print. And we're going to see which of these ones work the best for all of our processes. Now for this, keep in mind that this sculpture is the one that I use for whenever I want to add on to it. So I have a 3D printing pen and some tools to help manipulate the outside of the work. And so we'll go through all of that. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and do these prints, and then I will get talking about this. And then if you have any questions or comments in between, just let me know while I start to work on all of the videos for the infills and supports.